God, just to look at a dynamic that is so important in the church is that preaching dynamic. And so, guys, we talk about how to be better communicators. I pray it should be with Steve, pray it should be with our conversation. And God, I pray when we get to the top of the hour that we will have improved as communicators of your word. Pray this in Christ's name. Amen. Steve, it's all you, bud.
All right. Thanks, Tom. It's good to be on the call today. I want to start by saying that I have a love-hate relationship with preaching. I feel effective at it, and I enjoy doing it, but it's hard work for me. And I remember when I was a youth pastor, fairly easy to put together an outline for teenagers. I'd block a couple hours in an afternoon and come up with an outline and a few funny YouTube videos, and in a couple hours it'd be effective and it'd work well. And even when I was an associate pastor, a discipleship pastor, and I taught maybe once every other month or something, it really worked for me. I could have a few months to think about creative ideas and effective ways to communicate a topic and all of that. But when I became the primary communicator, the systems that I were using no longer worked for me. Sunday came around very quickly, and because it's hard work, I had to create some new systems that help me communicate at a high level on a consistent basis. And so today, that's really what I want to talk about, are some of the, what I'm just calling disciplines or approaches that I've picked up over the past 10 years or so that have helped me communicate at a higher level on a consistent basis. This is going to be less about how to put together a good outline. There's lots of great resources out there on that. This is going to be more just about some of my thoughts and approaches and disciplines when it comes to communicating effectively. So I have the outline for my notes that I sent to Tom. I think he'll be sending them out. But if they don't have them in front of them right now, do they, Tom? Okay, so you'll see it. I came up with 9 thoughts. You know, every preacher wants 10, but I realized that of the 9, probably wouldn't remember all 9 anyway. So if I gave you one more, it would just be another thing you wouldn't remember. So 9 thoughts when it comes to communicating effectively. And this just is out of my story. So, by the way, after each one of these, we're just going to spend some time to talk through it. If you have some thoughts on how you do that or what it means in your ministry, I think we'd all love to hear from each other on it. The first thought for me is great preaching is a team effort. Great preaching is a team effort. Now, again, some of you may be better at this than I am. It comes more natural to you. One of my mentors, Steve Giles, taught me early on that leadership and strategy come more natural to me than communicating. And so he encouraged me to swim with people who are more creative than I am. And so I've learned along the way that having people speaking into the process for me just makes everything better. So a couple ways that we do that is we have a creative team. And we meet with this creative team every Tuesday. So once a week we meet, and we're evaluating the week before, and then we're planning 4 weeks out, so a month ahead. And so what I'll do is I'll bring a big idea to the creative team, the message 4 weeks out, and then they just start spitballing content, illustrations, songs, videos, ideas. And that seems to really work for me because it just helps me get some ideas that I wouldn't have by myself. Also, I listen to a fair amount of podcasts. So once we have clarity of the message or the big idea, I'll go and see, how other communicators have taught on that topic. I was at a conference years ago, and they said that podcasts are modern day commentaries, and that really resonated with me. And so what's helpful for me is sometimes I will hear an illustration that someone will say, in a message, and it will spark an idea that I have for my own life that I wouldn't have thought of on my own. And that just helps me get some really good creative ideas. And then I have a preaching coach that, it might be Tuesday or Wednesday, Thursday in the week, or, and I'll just say, hey, Sunday's coming and I have a good message, but it's not a great message. I feel like I'm 2 thoughts away or an illustration away from really where it needs to be. And I'll email the message or just talk through the message over the phone. One time I did that. I sent my notes, and Steve Giles, again, is a preaching coach for me. And I sent him my notes. And those of you who know Steve, he kind of got back with me right away, and he said, hey, I really liked your opener, and then your message became schizophrenic, and it was just all over the map. I can't hang with you, and so we were able to talk through that. But for me, again, I've just learned that great preaching, although I'm the mouthpiece on the stage, great preaching for me is the result of a team effort. Now, I know that some of us may not have staffs with creative teams, and sometimes we think that we have to have paid staff to have a creative team. And yet I've discovered that some of our most creative people are actually not on our staff. They're in the seats on a Sunday morning. And so just because you may not have a paid staff with a creative team doesn't mean that you can't create a team where people are speaking into a creative process. I would love to hear from some of you on this. Have you noticed this to be true in your life? And if you do have other people who speak into your messages, how does that work for you?
Steve, I just want to affirm that the team sport idea, something that I remember back in the day. Some of you guys may remember Robin Wood and Gary Kendall used to get together. Maybe there was a few others on an annual basis and plan kind of the calendar. And I remember thinking, how cool is it to be able, because the culture I grew up in and preaching was a solo sport. I mean, my grandfather was a preacher and he developed his sermons like 5 minutes before he went in the pulpit. And he thought any kind of pre-planning wasn't of the Holy Spirit. You know what I mean? He'd be singing the last song, put his finger in his Bible and walk up there and talk for an hour. You know what I mean? I remember thinking, man, I want that. And so, some of the systems that you've mentioned, I've worked really hard to create, you know what I mean? When I was pastoring a local church. So I just wanted to applaud that. I was a better communicator on a weekly or monthly basis because I had other people speaking into the process.
Yeah, one of my observations, Steve, is that, most of our really phenomenal communicators that all of us would look at as, well, it's Andy Stanley or whomever it is. We think that they're solo because we only see them solo, but we have no clue. And I mean, and I know the team work that goes into that. It is a team sport, but you don't see it necessarily from the pulpit when they're preaching. But, all these guys are doing it as men and or women are doing it from a team perspective. And yet we tend to think it's a solo deal. So we got to do it solo. So I appreciate that.
Steve, talk to us more about your what a creative team meeting is like. I heard you say you bring a big idea and then you just kind of get into the creative process. Is there more to it than that?
Yeah, well, Ben Steers is on the call. We were together in Kansas City, and that was an incredible time where we had a teaching team. There were 3 or 4 of us, and we really worked on the messages together. And we worked on the big idea together, scriptures, thoughts, landing places, and then we'd go out and write the messages. But we had a lot of content that got the ball down the field. When I came to Salem, the creative team, and we started a creative team that basically has some of our teaching pastors. So for us, it's our missions pastor, our student pastor. And then it also has our worship arts pastor and some of our like communications director and a worship leader. And we have another person that's not on staff, but just highly creative. And so we get together and we're really planning the service for a month out through, songs and videos and, moments we're trying to create. But we start with the message. We start with, here's the journey we want to take people on. And I'll talk about the big idea in just a moment and that kind of thought process. But we start with the big idea, and I'll say, what ideas do you have? Is there an illustration? Is there a scripture? A couple of weeks ago, one of our worship leaders said, there's this, she kind of shared from her perspective on it, and it was just this great statement that she shared, and that was a very powerful part of the message. But it came from her, that I used 4 weeks later when I actually preached that message or whatever. So we give it about an hour and a half or so, where we're evaluating the week before and then we're planning ahead. But by the way, what I've discovered is if I can get the message done early enough, then I can send it to the creative team and I can get their feedback on the message. And it's always great to have feedback before I preach as opposed to feedback after I preach. And so they can get their eyes on it and say, hey, this makes sense or this doesn't make sense on Thursday, and that still gives me time for Sunday.
Steve, a couple follow-up questions. One, what podcasts are you listening to?
Yeah, so a lot of them would be the as far as communication, a lot of them are the ones that I think probably a lot of people listen to. The Andy Stanley's his podcast is one that I turn to. Lifechurch.tv is one that I turn to. I used to, some of the ones that I listen to are a leadership podcast is what's the hiring group?
Vanderbloemen.
Yeah, they have an assortment of church leaders that'll speak on there. And I just listened to one that was a preaching podcast. It was on, the topic was preaching, but it was on, kind of a different podcast. So I listened to a couple of those. Carrie's podcast, Newhoff's podcast, that's a helpful one for me as well.
Awesome. I had a follow-up question I've forgotten. We may have to circle back to it.
Okay. Let's go on to the second thought. And the second thought is just a build off of the first one, and that is a teaching team is healthy for a church. So not only is preaching a team sport, but a teaching team is healthy for a church. And again, I feel effective as a communicator, but I've learned that it actually is healthy for our congregation if I'm not always the communicator. And so the way we do it is we have a rotation. I'll teach the majority of the time. I shoot for about 40 times a year. Obviously that averages out to about once a month, but it's never that clean or simple. It tends to fluctuate a little bit, but over the course of a year, 40 times is my goal. And the reason why I've really locked into a teaching team, this was new for me. I didn't get into ministry with it, but I've really discovered that it gives our congregation a balanced spiritual diet. And what I mean by that is each teacher tends to come at a scripture through their own lens and their own perspective. And it just gives some insights that I think, in my life, I mean, maybe we all do, there are certain themes that are in my preaching that even though I might be covering different topics, there are certain themes that come out on a consistent basis. And when we have different team teachers, it allows sort of a different viewpoint or a different theme to surface. The second is people connect with different teaching styles. And I just acknowledge that and celebrate that. And so we want to allow some of our other teachers to teach because it's effective when they do. It's also good for me. It gives me a break and it helps me stay fresh. I'm able to get out a few weeks if I'm not preparing for this week. So that's helpful. It keeps the church from being based around a personality. I think we all get that. It's just healthy. And then it reinforces a value that we have, which is leadership development. In fact, oftentimes when we have some of our teaching members teach, and I'm not talking about a guest speaker here, I'm talking about people that are a part of our body who have a spiritual gift of teaching. And I will sit on the front row and I will introduce them. So it's not like these people are teaching because Steve's not here. It's Steve's here and they're teaching. And I'll oftentimes say, hey, church, it's incredible that we have others on our staff or others in our church who have the gift of teaching. And part of our responsibility as a church is to help them develop their God-given gifts. And so you help me welcome to the stage and, introduce them. And so it's not just an opportunity for them to preach, but it's an opportunity for our church to remember that God has called us to reproduce leaders. And so anyway, really, really, really bought into this idea of team teaching. Any thoughts or questions on that?
Steve, I got a question for you, buddy. So Salem, when you got there, was Salem already a teaching team church, or is that a transition that you made? And if so, if it was a transition, how did you make it?
Yeah, it wasn't. It was, but it wasn't. Before I came, there would be guests. There would be, staff members would teach occasionally, and then there would be some guest speakers. But it really wasn't kind of defined as we have a teaching team. The interim plan before I got here was the staff kind of carried the ball for the interim time, and so there were some voices that the congregation had gotten used to hearing more of, in the in-between time. And so we just rode that wave. And it was easy because we have a couple of young staff that are really good communicators, and people saw that. And so we were able to own that. And once I established my presence as a leader and kind of my voice from the pulpit, then I was able to say, it's so cool, as you guys know, that we have other teachers that are other pastors that are gifted teaching. And again, when I was first really trying to lean into it, I really leaned into the leadership development piece, because some may say, but we don't like hearing this or we don't like hearing that. But when you lean into the leadership development side of it, that sort of curbs that argument a little bit. Even if you don't like it, you understand that you get better by practicing, and so it's been a home run. But good teachers sell the teaching team concept. I have to cast the vision for it, but if you have good teaching team members, people are just bought into the idea, and I get. In fact, it was interesting to me. I actually got compliments because I was willing to share the pulpit. It was, and that was a surprise. That was a surprise. I didn't know I was going to get that, but they said, well, some pastors, sometimes they protect it like crazy. And well, I try to protect it, but they just were excited. The idea that, other people got to, and especially when it's like our student pastor, it's a great win for our student ministry for us to say, hey, your kids are under that teaching every week, and if you have kids or grandkids, you want them to be a part of that. They meet on Wednesday nights, and it just seemed like it's just a great win for our church.
Steve, I recalled my question from the earlier discussion. You said that the team is 4 weeks out. How far out are you as far as your really developed outline and or manuscript?
Yeah, I'm not that far out. I try to be a week or two out on really developing, the manuscript. I'll talk about that in a moment. One of the things I want to share is just kind of an annual planning cycle. And so the planning cycle starts with just these big ideas, and we're about a year out on that. And then as we get closer, we get to monthly ideas, and then we get to weekly ideas. And so I'm only 1 to 2 weeks out on like manuscript. I'm 4 weeks out on really having a good bead on it. And then, from there, it just kind of gets a little bit broader.
Gotcha.
So how many people on your teaching team?
There's 3 of us. So Actually, there's 4. So I would be the primary communicator, and then we have a student pastor and our outreach pastor, and each of them are younger leaders that we really feel called to not only develop but allow them to use their gifts. So they're teaching 3 to 4 times. They're teaching probably 4 times a year. Each of them are teaching 4 times a year. And then we have a senior adult pastor who is a former lead pastor, and he will preach probably twice a year. And then occasionally we'll have a guest speaker, Steve Childs. I've mentioned him. He'll teach a couple times a year, here. And so that kind of rounds out, basically 12 different Sundays.
Thank you.
And then when we have special events like our Ash Wednesday service, or our Good Friday service coming up, I tend to do very little with those, and our teaching team, other members of our teaching team take those. And that's an opportunity for them to develop as well. And of course, other venues when they're teaching with their team, student ministry and others, I tend to not be involved in those kinds of things. At Salem, we have an older congregation. So Richard, our senior adult pastor, he gets his fill of preaching from doing funerals.
Steve, how do you handle when someone says, one of the problems I see in a lot of guys who do teaching teams is it hurts their ego when they say, man, they really liked how someone else preached. It's almost like an ego issue. How do you handle that? Did you ever just experience that gut turn, or is that just pretty easy for you?
When I was working with Ben, people would say it to me about Ben all the time.
Yeah, right.
For me, it just reinforces the idea of a teaching team. I love the idea of it, so I don't feel it as like an insecurity on my part to feel like I need to defend my position as a preacher. I say, isn't it so great that we have people that are so gifted to do this? In fact, for some of them, it's their concern that there's going to be another church somewhere that calls some of our pastors away to go be primary teachers at their church, and so I'm able to use that and say, yeah, we want to continue to give our guys plenty of room to exercise this gift, so they don't go to other places to have to do it, so. For me, it's not an insecurity, and I try to make it just a win for our people, and I'll hear it occasionally. They'll say, hey, when, so-and-so taught, we really liked this, but didn't like that. Or, people feel like they need to, give me their evaluation as to how it went. And that's an opportunity for me to listen to what they're saying, but also, again, cast the vision to them as to why we do this and why it's healthy and all of that. But, part of our vision is multi-site and reproduction as a church. And so a teaching team really sets us up to be able to do some things in that area. And we don't, so anyway, I feel like if our vision is big enough, then there's really no need to be insecure. We all have plenty of chances to get an opportunity to do it. Let me move on to the third piece, which we've talked a little bit about, and that's big idea preaching. And, I wish I would have come across the big idea by the Ferguson brothers, Dave and John, when I was in college. That wasn't a part of our college curriculum, but I wish it would have been. For those of you that are unfamiliar with it, it's a great book. It basically talks about boiling down a message into one clear, simple, key concept. So a key scripture, a key thought, a key question, one clear statement, the big idea. And then everything about the message just reinforces the one big idea. So for me, that's been helpful in giving a series of big idea as well as each week a big idea. But then the big part of the big idea that's so helpful for me is the layering that it allows us to do. Most of us understand that the message starts before the sermon begins. The message starts before the sermon begins. And so we try to think of ways in the creative team about the big idea. How can we get people to experience the big idea sometime in the parking lot or in the lobby or in the big room as the worship service begins, through a song or a scripture or a video or whatever, so that when the teaching team member gets up to preach, they're simply picking up the ball that's already been marched down the field, and they're not trying to introduce the concept. They're just reinforcing a concept that's already been introduced. And all of that is made possible when there's one clear big idea. It also gives us an opportunity to have very targeted response times. And so what we do is, we tend to invite people to respond different ways through lighting candles or taking communion or using a prayer wall or an altar or something. And we just continue to go back to the big idea. Today you might want to respond by lighting a candle, and that would represent, and we just continue to tie it back to that same key concept. An area that we're trying to grow in right now is the layering that can happen after the message is over. Rod Stafford at Fairfax Community Church, they have a series wall. If you go into their lobby of the church, they have basically, we work so hard on creating these graphics for our series, and then the series comes and go and it's gone. They've discovered, people have God moments in these series with these big ideas. What if we could create a wall that has, a year's worth or 2 years worth or 3 years worth of series graphics, and when people see that graphic, it takes them back to a spiritual encounter they had one particular Sunday with one particular big idea. And so we're sort of toying around with that, how we can kind of reinforce the big idea even months after we've preached it. We're not there yet. But anyway, the big idea really helps with the whole layering process. Ben, do you guys use the big idea?
Yeah, I mean, right now, so I've been here 7 months. And so a lot of I come into a culture that's very much not a teaching team culture, not, like there would be guests, but they would come when the pastor is not here, sort of idea. And so in establishing that, I've introduced the big idea to our culture and to our teams. But we're also in a staff hiring situation. So the folks that will be a part of that creative team are largely not existent yet. And so, some of our student pastor position and worship pastor position, things like that are open holes on our staff. And so that is very much, the process that you're describing, unsurprisingly, is part of what we're trying to implement here. But it's a dream, an aspiration, not a reality yet.
Yeah.
Something I miss, honestly.
Yeah. Obviously the genius for me behind the big idea was if your churches are anything like my church, there are so many messages we're trying to communicate on one Sunday morning. And sometimes they work together and sometimes they don't, between song selections that have a different theme than the message, to scriptures we use that are great scriptures, but they're not connected with the message, to announcements, to a stewardship thought that's a great stewardship thought, but it, again, has nothing to do with the message. And so what the big idea has helped us with is just to be able to channel that. So in our creative team, we're kind of trying to go through the list and addressing these different areas. We call our stewardship thought, we call it a ministry moment. And basically we try to share a story that reminds people what happens when we give. And it's kind of a fulfillment of our mission story. And when we're firing on all cylinders, which isn't, doesn't happen always, but when we're firing on all cylinders, the ministry moment story actually connects with the big idea of the day. And it's probably more the exception than the rule right now. But that's when it's really happening well. Is it just is all just kind of this streamlined one big idea. Let me go to the fourth thought. When Tom asked me to give some thoughts to effective communicating, one thought that jumped out of my mind was to have a preaching plan. And again, I didn't learn this in college. Actually, Nelson Searcy. I got my hands on a resource that he created one time on a preaching calendar, how to have a preaching calendar, the importance of a preaching calendar. I don't know if that resource is still out there or not, but that was really helpful for me. And so I think about preaching plan in two ways. One is an annual plan and one is a weekly plan for me. The annual plan is basically we look at we take an annual approach and we try to harness the natural rhythms of our church life as well as our community calendar. And we will, look and say, okay, when are certain things happening that it makes sense to do certain kinds of series or certain kinds of messages, and we'll just try to identify just the natural flow of the church calendar or our community calendar, and we'll identify the months that we think are going to be more discipleship focused, or the months that we're going to have a series that has more of an evangelistic focus. Now, each week, it's really important to hear me say this. Each week, we speak to both audiences. Those who are followers of Christ and those who aren't sure what to think about Jesus. Each week we speak to both audiences, but there are some weeks or some months that we know it's going to be 70% focused on this, or 30, or however it works. Our annual plan kind of keeps that in mind. We do an annual survey. And so basically what happens at the end of our ministry calendar year, towards the end in June, we'll do an annual survey where we ask a number of questions. One of the questions or two of the questions has to do with messages. And we'll say, what do you want to hear? Which topics do you want to hear more about? Or we might even ask the question, if you were here the past year, which series were most helpful for you? And we'll give people a chance to check some boxes. It's so interesting to see what people want to hear more about and what they don't want to hear more about. And sometimes what they need to hear more about is the thing they don't want to hear more about. And so that information is really helpful for us. And then all of the pastors, even those who aren't a part of our teaching team, we take that information and we begin to sort of go through it together. And I'll ask the question, what do you think we need to talk about in the form of a message? There's some things we're going to do this year that aren't going to require a sermon, but what are the things that we need to talk about this next year from the pulpit in the form of series and preaching and messages? And so I just trust the people that are spiritual leaders. They lead teams. They're around other people. I trust them to have a sense of what God may be saying to them. And so each person shares, what's on their heart and mind and what they discern. And then we put that all through the filter of this next year. And we begin to look for big themes, and we identify some of our core values that maybe we need to heat up or speak to. We have some big rocks on our calendar where we have a vision series every August or September. We have a vision, like a State of the Union address every July. We have a fall focus in the fall where we align our sermons with our life groups and the curriculum. And so we kind of have some big rocks that we sort of just put on the calendar and begin to fill in around there. And then what I do is I take that information and I go out of the office for about a week in the summer. I take like a week-long, just what I call a study break. And I try to make sense of all of that information that we receive from the congregation and that I've received from pastors. And I try to put some sort of a plan together. And then I come back into my office and I share it with them. And I say, okay, guys, here's kind of what we talked about. I tried to put it to dates. Does this make sense? And we tweak it and work on it. And then about 3 weeks later, I try to get a few more days out of the office with their input again. And that's where I begin to, Tom, really kind of dive deeper into it and try to put big ideas and maybe weekly breakdowns. And if there's any scriptures that come to mind while I'm, just sitting there thinking about it, or, I kind of just begin to create a catalog of ideas under each one of those. And so that's all a part of our annual planning cycle. And then on a weekly basis, by the way, we also calendar out who's going to be teaching when. And, with the teaching team, I try to get ahead of it for their sake, so they know they can be preparing. But then on a weekly cycle, for me, sermon prep is like the quickest thing to get bumped on my calendar. And so I've learned that I just need to make it a big rock on my calendar. And I've learned I'm more creative in the mornings than in the afternoons. And so I just block my calendar and I set a goal to be done with the message by Wednesday at noon. That's my goal. Nobody put that on me. But if we're done by Wednesday at noon, it just helps everybody else out. So the people who are working on slides and worship arts and all of that. And typically it's really Thursday by the time I'm done, but the team already has my notes and I go up to them and say, hey, that scripture there, I'm tweaking it to this, or, whatever it is. But so having that deadline is really helpful for me on a weekly basis. But anyway, bottom line is having a preaching plan has been very helpful for me to be able to keep creative and to stay far enough out. And that helps our worship team and our communications team and our teaching team, because we have a sense of where we're going together. What are some of the ways that you've been able to implement a plan in your ministry, and what works about it, and where are you struggling with it?
Hey, something that I did before I began my current situation, the last 4 years when I was in Arkansas, was we would do a creative offsite, like a 3-day retreat with all of our ministry leaders. And their homework was to bring 5 to 7 ideas for sermon series. And then we would spend those 3 days pitching them, debating them, voting them, kicking them off the ship. And then we ended up at the end of our 3 days with a calendar. It was a process much more detailed than I have time to speak at in just a minute here. But we went through the weekend and ended up with a calendar with big ideas and sermon series that were on a calendar for the next year. And then I would take, like you took a week, I would take 3 more days myself and tweak all that and kind of come out with the same thing. But we did the team approach on a retreat, and then we would meet every week like you did. We were working 4 weeks out, and then I had my sermons done 2 weeks out. So it's very similar to what you've been doing. It's just that input at the beginning with all the different sermon ideas, which was cool. If something and a lot of them, of course, got marked off. We can't use that. But then you could save it for next time. You always had a recurring themes. It was really cool to see how many different people came with the same ideas. A lot of times we could mesh those together. So that worked really well for us.
At Indian Creek, a couple of years, we had a big idea retreat like that, where we invited like life group leaders or, key leaders, not everybody, but a group of people to come and do something similar. And it was always interesting to hear how many common themes came from different tables, if we break up into tables. And it was a way of sort of discerning maybe what God was leading you to speak about. I think about these processes in 2 ways: having an ear to heaven and an ear to the ground. And, I want to hear from God, but I also believe that God speaks through people, and sometimes it's our leaders, and sometimes it's our congregation members, and so that's kind of the general approach that I've brought to it.
So let me ask you: when you have your teaching teams? So I know you have your teaching plan that you do based off of a week. Does your teaching team follow the same plan?
Yeah.
How did you get them involved to follow your same plan? Because one of the challenges I have is I have a plan, and I'm trying to get people on my teaching team to follow the same plan, so everything is just, in sync.
Yeah. Well, they were a part of creating it, and that's part of how they have skin in the game, because they by the time I ask them to teach on a specific topic, a specific week, I've taken it to another level, but they were a part of, those idea conversations and how we got there and all of that. So it's typically not out of left field for them to know that that's where we're headed or whatever. And sometimes I try to use a sense of discernment too on which teaching team member could connect with that topic most effectively, and so I'll ask them to teach on something, if I can, something that's really in their wheelhouse, that's just something they love to teach about. And so it doesn't always work out that way, but that's a way to really try to, make that conversation easier when I ask them to teach, is it's something they want to teach on. Hey, Tom, I was thinking another way that I get ideas is that Steve Giles sends out an email I get it like every week or every month or something. I don't know. There's a whole list of people on it. I'm sure any of you could sign up for it if you want it. And it's just what he's doing at his church with his outline. And I think I just received his new series that he's going to be doing in 3 or 4 weeks, and it has a breakdown. And so just being able to swim with people who are more creative than I am is really, really helpful. And we live in a world where there's so many resources out there that can inspire ideas. And Rod Stafford, they have something that's like, it's sort of like Life Church Open, only I think it's Open Resources or something like that. And we use that from time to time, just kind of inspire some creative thoughts on that. All right, I'm watching our clock here. I'm going to fast forward through these last few ideas. Number 5 is shoot with both barrels. Shoot with both barrels. Andy Stanley has a book, Deep and Wide, and in that book he coins the phrase double barrel preaching. And I love to hunt and I love to preach, and so that really resonated with me. The idea with that is we have different audiences, we have different people in our audience every week. And the old seeker-sensitive model, where we were just going to preach towards the people who are far from God. The criticism was we were watering down the gospel. And then the church that I grew up in, I don't think anybody was far from God that I knew of. And so really all the sermons were geared towards people who had been following Christ probably their whole lives. And so this approach of double barrel preaching recognizes that let's speak to people where they are, and let's provide entry points and points of application for people at different places in their spiritual journey. So the way we've contextualized this idea at Salem is we want to make it easy for people to find Jesus, but we want to keep the bar high for people when it comes to following Jesus. And so what that means for us is we want to use everyday stories, clear application points, normal conversation. We avoid code language and religious terms. We want to make it very easy for people to find Jesus while keeping the bar high for what it means to be a follower of Christ. And we speak to both groups that way. Some Sundays I'll say something like, for those of you who are here and you're not a follower of Christ, you get a bye on this one. I want to speak to those of you who are here who are followers of Christ. And when I say that, what I've discovered is it does a couple things. It acknowledges that there's multiple people in the room. We welcome people. I'll say, if you're here today and you're not a follower of Christ, we're so glad you're here. You get a bye on this one. Let me speak to those who are followers of Christ. So we've welcomed them. We've acknowledged them. And then sort of the side benefit is I've discovered that they actually lean in when I tell them to sit back. But when I say you get a bye on this one is when they really key in to see what I'm going to tell the other group of people that when I'm not talking to them. And so it's really interesting how that happens. But that's been an effective way that we've been able to preach both barrels. I've discovered that if I speak to people as if they're in the room, over time they will be in the room. But if I speak to people assuming they're not in the room, over time likely they won't be in the room. And so what I mean is, we just started talking to non-believers as if they're here. Hey, we know many of you are here and you have no idea what to think about Jesus. Well, next thing we know, our church people are inviting their friends who don't know what to think about Jesus, because we know we're going to be talking to people who don't know what to think about Jesus. And then there are times that I'll say, some of you have been following Christ for 2 times longer than I've even been alive. And, and I just kind of acknowledge that dynamic of our congregation. And so we work at just trying to say, hey, look, we're not going to speak to one or the other. We're going to speak to both. And some Sundays we do better at that than others. Some Sundays we're kind of 70-30 or 60-40 or, whatever it is. But we work really hard at addressing both audiences. And it's hard this way. I mean, I would rather preach to one group. It's really difficult to preach out of both barrels. But it seems to be really, really effective to try to connect with all the people in the room. I also try to picture certain people. So we have like this 92-year-old guy who's a door greeter who's, been a follower of Christ forever. I sort of think of him sometimes when I preach. And then my wife and I just finished renovating a house, and one of our contractors now attends. His name is Joe. He was our tile guy. So Tile Man Joe. And I think about Tile Man Joe when I preach. He's this kind of man's man, stoic, and, his wife sort of drug him to church with him. And, I just kind of keep both those guys in my mind, when I speak. Let me give a couple more thoughts on this double barrel preaching. Our creative team also has a double barrel approach when we create worship services. And so we want to create worship services for non-believers that are so inspiring that they don't know what to think about Jesus, but they sense the passion, the authenticity. There was even some heart movement that happened for them, and they don't know exactly what it was, but they want to come back because it's so inspiring. And then for followers of Christ, we want to create an environment that's so inspiring that it helps them grow. It helps them take their next step, and they want to invite somebody else to experience it as well. So those are kind of the 2 wins that we think of with our creative team when it comes to worship services. And all of this has been taken from Andy Stanley's Deep and Wide. But it doesn't just affect my preaching. It also affects how we create worship services, is what I'm trying to say. Side note, nearly every week, we present the gospel. And we do that just from this conviction that we never know when somebody's heart is open to receiving Christ. And so even if it doesn't seem like it has a direct connect with that particular topic, typically at the end of the message, I'll say something like, so look, some of you are here today and all of this has been good, but you're really not sure what you think about Jesus. And maybe today you feel something in your heart, your spirit, you have no idea what it is. Let me speak to that for a moment. And we'll just do a simple gospel presentation. And, it gets a little old, repetitive at times, because you just feel like, we're just doing this all the time. And a couple months ago, I received a text message from a young lady named Jessica, who was baptized a couple years ago. And her husband, Shane, came to her baptism, but she didn't know if he would or not. I mean, it was one of those situations. Well, after that, he started attending worship services fairly regularly. And long story short, she texted me to say, hey, Pastor Steve, you know how you do that every week? She said, honestly, I didn't like that part of our service because I thought, why does he do this every week? And then I discovered that my husband, Shane, without me even knowing it, one of those weeks, something about that week, something about God speaking to him, he gave his heart to Christ, and now he wants to be baptized, and so for me, that's just the reinforcement to say, hey, we just never know. And so we make it a big deal every week to try to present the gospel. Double barrel preaching. Any thoughts on that? If not, I'm going to move us along for the sake of time. Number 6, invite people into a better story. This is less about a discipline and more about an approach. John 10:10 is really a theme scripture for me. Satan came to steal, kill, and destroy, but Jesus came that we might have life and have it to the full. And one of my postures when I preach is we live in a broken world. There's so much pain and suffering. And I want to be a communicator that doesn't water down the gospel at all, but invites people into a Jesus way of life that's attractive. I think we would all agree that the kingdom life is better than the life that we used to have. And so as a communicator, I want to invite people into that story. I was with a group of pastors a couple months ago, and the question was asked, how do you handle the entitled generation in your church? The entitled generation. I think they were talking about millennials, but the question was the entitled generation. And one of the pastors spoke up, Jeremy Dixon, and he said something I thought was so helpful. He said, I think we just need to tell them what they're entitled to. And what he was meaning by that is, many of us have, we don't want to be labeled as prosperity gospel preachers. We don't want to water down the gospel, and maybe somewhere in that we've lost sight of this beautiful kingdom life that's full of incredible promises from God. There's a lot of if-then statements and a lot of beauty in following Jesus. And maybe if we remind our people what they're entitled to, then they won't have to settle for smaller battles when they're trying to fight for entitlement, if we invite them into a better story. And so anyway, that's just a general posture and tone that I take when I preach. This is something I really want for you, not from you. Number 7, lead strategically through your preaching. Lead strategically. I know we've probably all been a part of conversations where we separate them, and leadership gifts are different than preaching gifts, and I agree with that. I've also discovered, John Maxwell talks about leadership as influence, and I've discovered that preaching gives a lot of influence to leadership. And if you preach well, it gives you equity to lead. And just a couple of thoughts on this. Since leadership is influence, preaching gives you an opportunity to not just influence people, but also to influence a church, to influence an organization. Preaching well builds leadership credibility. Some people only know us by our preaching, and so their view of how we're leading is based upon our ability to preach. And that could be right or wrong, but that's the way it is for some people. Preaching creates culture. For many of our churches, our worship services are one of the first experiences that they're going to have with our church. And they get a sense of who we are as a church. And so authenticity is a big deal in our preaching, because that can create a culture of it's okay to not be okay. And that they begin to feel the culture of the church, but that comes from our preaching. And then preaching gives a chance to cast vision. I won't park here long because I think many of us get this, but we have an opportunity to not hijack a message, but still cast vision in subtle ways. A while back, I was talking about something from a message, and I was talking about this new ministry that we're going to start. And I gave a side comment where I just said, and if it doesn't work, we're going to stop doing it. And I just kind of a side comment, and then I went about my way. Well, there was a big thinker in our church, one of the guys that any of us would love to have in our church. Just kind of, you can change the world with these kind of people. They came up to me afterwards, and that's the comment they wanted to talk about. It was just a total side comment, but they loved it because they love being a part of a church that evaluates, and they want to be a part of an organization that's effective and efficient. And if it doesn't work, let's not do it, and it's just a kind of a little comment that didn't hijack the message, but it somehow kind of cast a vision for who we are as a church. Number 8, let me get through the rest of these and we'll jump back into Q&A. Number 8, how you say what you say is as important as what you have to say. How you say what you say is as important as what you have to say. These days, I'll run through a sermon probably 3 times before I preach it on a Sunday. And I didn't always do that, but I attended a conference years ago where the speaker was basically reaming preachers. And he said, we want our worship teams to rehearse. I think our preaching teams ought to rehearse as well. And that really stuck with me. And for some churches who have 2 or 3 or 4 services, their first service is like their run-through service. And I just sort of wanted to not be that preacher. I wanted to try to work out as many kinks as I could before the first service. And for me, when I hear myself say it, it makes the message come alive. There's something about getting it off paper and into my heart. I learn where the message swells, where it lulls. I learn kind of how to tell stories in ways, how to tell jokes. A lot of jokes are kind of, you win or lose in the delivery. And when I hear myself say it, it helps me deliver it more effectively. So here's kind of my general thought with that. Authenticity is important, but it's not an excuse for sloppy preaching. And for me, there's kind of a balance of keeping my heart, making it feel like every time I preach it is the first time I've ever preached it. But yet I still know what I'm going to say, and I still know how I'm going to say it. And then over time, it's funny because even as I work hard on my delivery, the first service can still be different from the second service. If I just feel nudged to lean into a certain idea or, something, I try to still remain open to how God might lead in those moments, but I work hard on delivery. And then the last one, number 9, is speaking of authenticity. Authenticity, passion, and humor connect across different levels of spiritual maturity and different generations. Authenticity, passion, and humor connect across different levels of spiritual maturity and generations. One of our beautiful challenges at Salem, for example, is we are a very intergenerational church. And that's been somewhat of a challenge, but it's a sort of a beautiful challenge that we've just tried to own and claim. And, people say that millennials really prefer like a mentoring approach to preaching. Don't preach at me, but mentor me. And I've discovered that actually that approach works across all generations. A mentor is someone who's for you. They have some insights from their own life that they want to share with you. They're in your corner. They're not just going to tell you what you need to do. In many cases, they can walk alongside you. And so we try to take that approach to our preaching, where it's less of a preach at you, and it's more of a mentor approach to preaching, what we've learned, what we're studying, what we're struggling with, some things that have helped. And that seems to really connect across different generations. Also, the whole idea of just sharing our own stories and our illustrations or sharing other stories is a really big idea. I don't mean to sound trite with this, but one of the most helpful tools that we can have as communicators. Sometimes people say, hey, where do you get your stories? Well, having 4 kids helps me. It gives me a lot of sermon fodder. But also, living a somewhat interesting life gives me somewhat interesting sermons. And I have to work hard at that, because if not, my life can be the church. And, if your life is the church, you sort of run out of real life stories every once in a while. But I try to spend time in the gym. I love to hunt, try to stay connected with sports. And through some of those venues, we spend time at our family's lake house, or we go to Florida often. And it just seems like along the way of doing life, stories will happen that aren't church stories, right? And so I think that's just important. One of my favorite scriptures when it comes to ministry is 1 Thessalonians 2:8. That said, we love you so much that we share with you not only God's good news, but our own lives as well. And as preachers, one of the ways that we can share our lives with people is through our preaching. Some people only know us by our preaching, and it's a way that we can invite people into the living room of our lives and allow them to get to know us and hear from us. So humor, speak to that for just a moment. Laughter. In our generation, I think laughter may be one of the most evangelistic tools we have, because so many people think of church as boring. The church I grew up in, not talking poorly about it, it was just boring. I don't think the goal was for it to be inspiring. Good people and good content, it was just boring. And so we really try to lean into humor, because there's something about humor that connects with people. It's just the emotional connection, and then we can speak a spiritual truth after the walls have come down for people of all ages and regardless of where they are on their walk with Christ. So passion, authenticity, and humor connect. Tom?
Yeah, powerful, Steve. Thank you so much, bro. Appreciate your investment in the group that was on the call today. There were several actually dialed in my phone. I don't know if you saw that at the top of the screen. So, and many others will listen to the recording. So thanks again for your investment. It was just leadership gold, bro. So many good tips and thoughts on preaching. I hope everyone on the call found it helpful. Just
Hey,
a reminder, third Thursday
on
next month, 2 Eastern. Go
Well,
ahead, Steve.
Yeah, one piece on there I wanted to mention, the whole process of prayer behind all of this, I didn't write it in because it's assumed, but the piece about having multiple teams and having an annual process is that prayer is woven throughout all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just, hey, Sunday's coming, so let's pray about it. It's like we've been praying about this Sunday for a year now. And anyway, I just think that's an important piece to mention behind all that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, again, I was just mentioning in next month's call, Biz Ganey, it's going to be a phenomenal moment, much like today was. So hope you'll plan on being around. And with that, dismissed. See you later. Have a great day. Have a great week. We'll see y'all next month. Thanks again, Steve.